In the beginning, there was a utopia, the dream of a better life, a better world, and better people. This vision was once embraced by millions worldwide. My parents were young, barely in their mid-20s, when they were allowed to go to Moscow to study in 1965. They lived in East Germany. The USSR was considered to be their big brother country. For them, it was a privilege to study here. But was it really the better side of the world? The idea that socialism was the more just society crumbled along with the Soviet Union. What remains of this empire today, so many years later? For me as a filmmaker, my first resource are my parents' private films. What do they tell us that the official propaganda doesn't? What do an old Soviet cookbook or a pack of cigarettes tell us? We follow the splinters of history in search of a lost time. It was the day after all the chaos. The day after the military coup in the Soviet Union. It was a sunny day in August 1991 in Leningrad. At this point, no one knew how this coup would end. The people rejected it, but the huge country was at the end of its tether. Economic hardship had awakened a longing for national identity. The coup was a last desperate attempt to save the huge empire, the Soviet superpower. But the people no longer wanted to save this state. They erected barricades and protested. The Soviet Union was at its end. Current President Mikhail Gorbachev was on holiday in Crimea at the time. On the morning of 19th of August, he heard on the radio that Perestroika, his program of transformation, was now over. Emergency decrees were broadcast. Then, excerpts from Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake were played, as was done when great political leaders die. Gorbachev's will to transform, or glasnost for short, was probably the last Soviet utopia. Now, he was accused of conspiracy against his own country. Powerless, he returned to Moscow, but remained president for the time being. During a televised address to the Soviet people, everything looked the same as it always did. He was served a hot cup of tea, as usual. But that small detail could not hide the fact that this was the beginning of the end. The Soviet Empire once reached as far as Berlin. Even from here, back in the summer of 1991, people looked anxiously in the direction of Moscow.
Was sagen Sie dazu?
И какое ваше отношение?
Очень испугалась.
Ich bin sehr erschrocken gewesen.
Ja.
Очень боюсь, не знаю, что будет дальше.
Was ist denn so passiert?
Wovor haben Sie Angst?
И чего вы боитесь?
Как жить дальше?
Wie wir weiterleben sollen.
Это переворот должен был происходить, да?
Конечно.
Aber der Umsturz, der musste ganz einfach kommen.
Warum musste der
А
Umsturz kommen?
почему?
Ну, люди не живут как надо.
Und weil einfach das Leben nicht so ist, wie es sein sollte.
Ich bin also für demokratische Ansicht. Ich bin eigentlich von der Überzeugung her Antikommunist. Mir scheint, dass also die Gespräche über die Erhaltung der Sowjetunion sie dazu führen, dass ein neues Imperium auferstehen wird. Und ein solches Imperium hat die Geschichte noch nicht gekannt. Das wird schrecklich sein. Und ich bin gegen diesen Umsturz natürlich.
In August 1965, my parents set foot on Russian soil for the first time. My mother wanted to become a ballet teacher. My father wanted to study painting restoration. Their curiosity about this new life in Moscow was intense. Both of them often recall the huge city, the melancholy of its people quickly passing each other by. In Lenin's promised land, people rarely smiled. On a cold, wintry day, my parents joined the long queue of people waiting patiently at the Lenin Mausoleum. A soldier stopped my mother from putting her icy hands in her coat pockets. Behind her, a couple of Russian women claimed they had heard that Lenin was no longer real. Even then, the deep veneration of Lenin had degenerated into a tourist spectacle. The red granite memorial in Moscow's Red Square had become a symbol worldwide. It was here that Soviet moments of triumph were celebrated. All the great leaders of the Soviet Union stood on the roof of the mausoleum and photographed the parades. The architects positioned the Lenin Mausoleum at the center of attention, as a communist pilgrimage site. They predicted that the cube would become more significant than Mecca or Jerusalem. The propaganda machine made full use of photographs of patiently waiting people. The Russian miracle, that is the idea of communism, they said. Planning for the mausoleum began only one day after the death of revolutionary leader Vladimir Ilyich Lenin in 1924. As the stream of mourners continued for several days, it was also decided to preserve the body, a modern death cult. The body of the revolutionary leader was proof of the existence of Leninism. Only a few days after his death, the city of St. Petersburg was renamed Leningrad. This is where the great turning point began. It is the city of the Great Socialist October Revolution. My first big plane trip was to Leningrad. I was 8 years old and didn't know much about the Soviet Union or Lenin. But I knew the Russian fairy tales, where poor peasant girls got married to princes. When we met Marat in Leningrad, I thought he looked like a film star. He took us to visit the Tsar's summer palace on a very hot day, and I was a princess in the midst of all that Tsarist splendor. In the midst of socialism, the glamour of a bygone era shimmered. That era ended in 1917. Russia was a country racked by despair, poverty, and brutality. The First World War had further bled it dry. Lenin, the son of a nobleman, was the right man at the right time. Theories were not his thing. He saw himself as an implementer. With no actual plan in mind, he called for wholesale revolution. In the end, it took just 10 days in October to change the world. Images of the Great October Socialist Revolution, burned into our collective memory, were staged images, like those from director Sergei Eisenstein. The birth of the Soviet Empire in beautiful St. Petersburg went down in history as a work of cinematic art. The founding myth of the USSR needed images of heroes who charged, died, and won. However, that charge probably never happened. But the wiping out of an almost 300-year-old Tsarist dynasty and building a superpower could not be narrated like that. That would have been too banal. Lenin was hailed as an icon of Russian heroism. He had overthrown the hated monarchy.
Россия, Россия, родные вольные края. Россия, Россия.
Lenin made utopia a reality. He remained the good Bolshevik, and yet he had laid the groundwork for a truly terrifying dictatorship. In December 1920, the revolutionaries had decided Russia was to be snatched from darkness and backwardness. The world watched, fascinated, for the pace was breathtaking. Images of the success of socialist heroism would dominate reports about the USSR for decades to come. Water was to flow into deserts and steppes, and new power plants were to send light into thousands of villages. According to Lenin's doctrine, socialism is Soviet power plus electrification. Homo Sovieticus, the Soviet man, was created. He belonged to a country made up of 15 nations. Joseph Stalin, the man who would succeed Lenin, established what he considered to be a multi-ethnic state. He presented himself as a savior. He created the myth of a united Soviet people. Marat, my parents' friend, once said, "Stalin was loved because we Russians love pain." He often said such things with a sad smile, smoking the strongest cigarettes in the USSR. They were called Bielomokanal. The Papyrosa logo became a symbol for one of Stalin's most megalomaniac canal construction projects. Measuring 227 kilometers in length, the canal was supposed to connect Leningrad with the White Sea. 21 million cubic meters of earth had to be moved. Anything that stood in the way of the canal's construction was eradicated. This could only be done with an unbelievable amount of sheer manpower. Most workers were forced laborers or prisoners, supposedly some 250,000 of them. Social scum, they consisted of counter-revolutionaries, intellectuals, artists, upper-class women with delicate hands, even thieves and prostitutes. They were all to be remolded into the ideal Soviet worker. Between 1928 and its opening in 1932, 12,800 people suffered death by labor during the construction of the Bielomor Canal. In the end, the canal never fulfilled its purpose. It was too shallow. But Stalin had opened a new chapter with this project. It was called the Gulag system, brutal labor and reform camps for dissenters. As a bank robber in Tbilisi, Georgia, he once gave himself the cover name Stalin, the steely one. He retained this name and lived by the motto, "Great works demand great sacrifices." The individual counted for little in Stalin's country. Only the collective idea made miracles come true. Magnitogorsk, the steel city, was one such miracle. 1,200 kilometers from Moscow, a steel cathedral made of chimneys and blast furnaces stood in the middle of the steppe. 20 kilometers long and 10 kilometers wide. Here, it became reality. The new man in the form of the laborer. Magnitogorsk, the most modern steelworks in the world, was growing into the ideal socialist showcase project. The official propaganda, however, concealed the fact that its technology was bought from the USA in 1929. At that time, thousands of communist youth volunteers from all over the world came to Magnitogorsk. The railway station was a goods depot. They lived in tents or barracks. First came the factory. It was the beginning of a heroic era. A victory was to be won here over backwardness. The steel city became the symbol of modern Russia. Back in the 1930s, Dutch filmmaker Joris Ivens made his film Hero's Song about the young workers on the construction site. Myth, revolutionary kitsch, and lies were all woven closely together. But the images of terror were missing. Stalin also had forced laborers deported to Magnitogorsk. Stalin's Gulag system was shrouded in silence in the USSR for decades. When my parents were studying in Moscow in the 1960s, they were stunned to hear Lala's story at a student party. She was 4 when her parents were arrested. They'd starved to death in the Gulag. At the time, it sounded almost unbelievable. Only much later would the world learn that at least 18 million people were imprisoned in Stalin's camps. One of them was writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He spent 8 years in a Gulag for criticizing Stalin in private letters. In West Germany, a play was performed for the first time in 1975 based on the novel Archipel Gulag by Solzhenitsyn. For the first time, the extent of the terror became public.
Hier leben wir in Gulag. Das ist ein unsichtbares Land. Du findest es auf keiner Landkarte, in keinem Geschichtsbuch. Kein Psychologe schreibt darüber. Es ist das berühmte Land, in dem 99 weinen und einer lacht. Ich ziehe es vor zu lachen.
Mir ist nicht zum Lachen.
In 1974, the writer had to leave his hometown Moscow overnight, involuntarily. The publication of his novel in West Germany cost him his home. His first refuge after his expulsion was the holiday home of writer Heinrich Böll, near the Belgian border.
Hat alles erklärt. Ich glaube, sehr plausibel.
Ich bin sehr müde. Und ich bin besorgt wegen meiner Familie.
Er kann erst weitersprechen, wie er gesagt hat, wenn sich seine Situation geklärt hat. Dann wird jede Gelegenheit sein, mit ihm zu sprechen, sobald er es wünscht. Und ich fände es gut, wenn Sie jetzt gehen. Bitten Sie das nicht als ungastlich zu verstehen, damit er Ruhe gibt. Räumen Sie doch bitte den Hof. Und mehr ist heute nicht zu sagen.
Solzhenitsyn described in his book how, since his imprisonment, he associated the smell of bread with survival. It is only through him that the world learned of Stalin's cruelty. While thousands of people were dying of hunger in Stalin's camps, the dictator had a political cookbook published, the Book of Tasty and Healthy Food. The volume shows socialist snapshots, mainly ready-made products featuring simple traditional recipes and teaching table manners. Stalin wants to show how modern, rational, and economical nutrition could be. To the Soviet people, the illusion of opulence in this book must have seemed almost pretentious. But Joseph Stalin had proclaimed, "Life has become more joyful, comrades. The time of renunciation and asceticism is over." That's what Stalin wanted. In 1935, he abolished the card system for food. In Moscow, prosperity was presented to a new socialist elite. The old had to make way for the new. The city had outgrown itself in the years after the revolution. In 1930, almost 3 million people lived in Moscow. They not only all had to be housed, but also moved around. Building a metro became Stalin's favorite project. He wanted to have the most beautiful metro in the world. Underground palaces for the people. People spent happy days, while at the same time, a dark veil of fear and terror settled over the country. From 1937 onwards, denunciations, show trials, and waves of arrests turned Moscow into the city of the great Stalinist terror. Stalin was neurotic, intoxicated by power. He no longer even trusted his followers. He had them shot, just because their facial expressions seemed suspicious to him. Stalin maintained his grip on power by spreading fear and terror for years. However, the dictator only established his image as savior of the world after the Allies' victory over fascist Germany in 1945. Stalin grabbed half of Europe from Western powers by treaty. His justification? The Soviet army had liberated Europe and its own homeland from fascist occupiers. The Great Patriotic War was the bloodiest in the country's history. The Soviet Union had 27 million dead to mourn. The heroes who survived were celebrated. They were the basis for the myth of Russian sacrifice, the ever-changing narrative of the resurrection of the people from hardship and suffering. This aroused patriotic feelings. Since that point, the victory celebrations in November were much more than a nationwide commemoration. The victory of good over evil was celebrated. Stalin appropriated this victory for himself. When the dictator died on the 5th of March 1953, he left behind a country in which good and evil had long since become indistinguishable. He had the power to turn lies into truth. Only after Stalin's death would the whole truth gradually come to light. 10 years later, when my parents were studying in Moscow, there were signs that the country was trying to free itself from its isolation. Moscow showed itself to be a cosmopolitan city. For my mother, a dream had come true. She was a classical dancer and had to end her career after an injury. Now, she was allowed to study with the stars of the Russian ballet, to attend rehearsals at the Bolshoi Theatre. As a child, I was given this photo by the great ballerina Natalia Dudinskaya herself, with a dedication. By then, she was a little old lady with bad knees. She received us in Leningrad in a magnificent flat. I remember that she invited us in with a graceful gesture. With Natalia Dudinskaya, one sensed that the great lineage of classical ballet was probably the only art form in the USSR that had survived the revolution unscathed. Grace and beauty in classical ballet come from rigorous daily training. For decades, Soviet ballet schools had been teaching according to the so-called Vaganova method. It was named after a prima ballerina who developed a language of movement. This knowledge of classical dance was not passed on through books, but through the work of the ballet masters with the students. The strict teaching of tradition through showing. It was the illusion of effortlessness, of lightness that thrilled the audience. The famous prima ballerinas made the theatre hall cheer with their virtuoso physical technique, worldwide. In the West, too, Russian ballet was celebrated as the most beautiful export of socialism. When Galina Ulanova and the Moscow Bolshoi Theatre gave a guest performance in New York in 1959, thousands scrambled for tickets.
Die große prima ballerina der Moskauer Oper, Galina Ulanova in der Metropolitenoper. Sie ließ ihre Verehrer für ein paar Stunden alles vergessen, was unsere Welt so unselig trennt.
The splendor of old Russian culture is what my parents still associate with their student days. Among the few mementos they have kept from their time in Moscow, for example, is an old icon. My father had restored many icons back then and was allowed to keep one as a memento. It may sound pathetic, but what remains with my parents to this day is a deep attachment to what is called the Russian soul. As students, they often traveled some distance from Moscow to old monasteries and churches. It was the Russia of old that they encountered there. And what they saw was that the Soviet Union's enforced progress barely seemed to have reached outside of the big cities. Here in the countryside, time stood still, as if the revolution had never happened. But Soviet cultural policy also knew how to use this magic of originality for its own ends. Just as running water and electricity had been brought to every corner of the land, culture was to be spread throughout the country. An East German documentary from the 1980s tells the story of passionate theatre people who travel along the River Ob every year by boat to dock at villages and perform. The great classics, comedies and fairy tales. In the USSR, culture was supposed to belong to everyone.
Und für uns Erwachsene ist es auch immer ein Ereignis, etwas Neues. Sonst sehen wir doch sowas hier nicht. Wenn das Tobolsker Theater zu uns kommt, ist das ein Feiertag. Und welche Stücke mögen Sie? Ich sehe mir alles an, nacheinander. Zu den Tragödien gehe ich nun nicht mehr. Da muss ich immer zu weinen, da stört mich das Alter.
А что полегче, это для меня хорошо, я иду с удовольствием.
Finding talent in the vast country of the Soviet Union was also part of the class struggle. The Georgian city of Tbilisi is almost 2,000 kilometers from Moscow. this is where what was called a talent factory was created in the 1970s. Here, the virtuosos of classical music were made. Here, gifted children from all over the country were trained to become stars. The USSR would demand the ultimate performance, one that would move a person to tears. In the summer of 1980, we spent our holiday with Marat and his wife Lydia in Georgia. At one point, Marat told us almost casually that his father had been taken away by Stalin's secret police in 1937. My mother asked if he had ever looked for him. Marat must have smiled mildly. What a question. Adults at the time reflected a lot on living with the lie, talking about acquired truth. I was 9 years old and understood little of all this. For me, this holiday was the most beautiful of my childhood, with white villas and botanical gardens, sun and sea. The Riviera of the East. Shortly after the end of the Second World War, futuristic trains took Soviet workers to this dream destination. The world should see that the Soviet power cared about its people. In post-revolutionary Russia, the white villas on the Black Sea coast, where the Tsar's family and Russian aristocrats once holidayed, were nationalized and converted into sanatoriums. The magnificent buildings were now important symbols of power. They were also a sign of the victory of socialism. Everyone was able to relax here. Scientists, metal workers, teachers, and above all, heroes of the Soviet Union. Heroes like Yuri Gagarin. These pictures show Gagarin with his family in 1961 on a summer holiday in Sochi on the Black Sea coast. Completely carefree and close to the people, a hero with whom everyone can identify. The Soviet Union was the land of heroes. Anyone could become one, but the path to becoming one had to be self-sacrificing and courageous. Yuri Gagarin was the perfect hero.
Der erste Mensch im Kosmos, ein Kommunist.
On the 12th of April 1961, a dream of mankind came true. Gagarin was the first man in space. The Soviet cosmonaut would orbit the Earth for 108 minutes. For the first time in its history, Russia was technically superior to the West. The world suddenly looked on the USSR and Yuri Gagarin, the conqueror of the sky, with new respect and admiration.
После запуска первого спутника у меня появилась мечта, а может быть когда-нибудь и я стану космическим путешественником. Когда-нибудь, возможно, поведу космический корабль в просторы Вселенной. И, очевидно, с тех пор и заболел этой космической болезнью.
No one seemed more suitable than him. Gagarin was in perfect physical shape, and his background fit the narrative perfectly. The son of a carpenter and a peasant woman, he embodied the man of his time. A simple Soviet boy from the village who radiated boundless patriotism and unflinchingly believed in the success of flight. He had to, because his return from space was by no means certain.
Земля, я космонавт. Проверка связи закончил. Самочувствие хорошее, к старту готов.
Yuri Gagarin became the Soviet Union's first global star. In Rome, the film diva Gina Lollobrigida is even said to have given him a kiss. With the cosmonaut's success, the USSR came to represent the ideal of a better world, radiant, progressive, and for the good of all mankind. Nikita Khrushchev, the new man at the head of the Soviet Union, was infinitely grateful to the cosmonaut. Once again, a race with the USA had been won. The USSR chalked up Gagarin's flight as a victory for socialism. For this, he was revered almost religiously. Yuri Gagarin was given 6,924 awards, medals, and honorary titles. The Cosmos cult became the USSR's third propaganda pillar after the October Revolution and victory in the Great Patriotic War.
Die West-Berlin-Frage muss einer Lösung zugeführt werden, da die anomale Lage den Frieden in Deutschland und in Europa bedroht.
The great socialist experiment had been threatening to flounder for some time. Above all, divided Berlin was increasingly becoming a problem. The city was divided into 4 sectors by the Allies after the end of the Second World War. The Americans, British and French controlled the western part of the city, while East Berlin was part of the Soviet sector. The city became a secret gateway to the West. Socialist East Germany, the GDR, was in danger of being bled dry. In 1961, Kremlin leader Khrushchev began to increase pressure on Western powers. Together with the GDR, he pushed for a peace treaty that called for the withdrawal of the Allies from West Berlin. The successful spaceflight had given Khrushchev new momentum. But Western powers did not give in. With the construction of the Berlin Wall in August 1961, East Germany not only secured its own continued existence, but also, in a sense, the Soviet Empire. Shortly after the wall was built, a Belgian journalist wanted to know what East Berliners thought about it.
Ist es richtig so, dass die Mauer ist, ja?
Meinen Sie wirklich?
Ja, das ist richtig so, dass die Mauer ist.
Ich bin Berliner, nee, die Mauer muss weg, man kann ja nicht zu seinen Verwandten. Also ich bin eine von denen, ich bin im staatlichen Handel. Aber ich würde jedes Wochenende zurückkommen. Denn man hatte ja vorher die Gelegenheit zu gehen. Und dann habe ich eine Mutter von 78 Jahren, die würde auch immer wieder zu ihrer Tochter gehen. Aber mal so wenigstens so, alle 4 Wochen müssten wir schon mal rüber können.
Ja, also ganz ehrlich, das musste sein. Es war 1961 höchste Zeit, dass sie gekommen ist.
At the time, my parents also believed that it was the best way. But only a few years later in Moscow, they learned the painful lesson that socialism is only superficially a more humane society. They were looking for a flat together, but they were only entitled to a room in a dormitory, and then only separately. Weekends in Gorky Park were their only small freedom. It was almost a miracle that they found a flat in their second year in Moscow, in a so-called Khrushchevka, a 5-story prefabricated building. Most Soviet citizens at that time lived in cramped communal flats. There was a family in every room, but my parents had their own little empire. The new dream flats of socialism were transported already assembled to the construction site. The rooms were low and narrow. You could hear every noise from your neighbor's flat. A lifestyle very much like that in the unpopular communal apartments, but with a little more privacy. The standardized prefabricated flats spread rapidly throughout the entire Eastern Bloc.
In größerer Zahl solche Wohnungen bauen zu können,
entstand eine eigene Industrie. Ihr Motto lautet:
Urban planners in East Germany in particular loved this highly efficient construction method. Within a very short time, living space could be created for tens of thousands of people. Schools, kindergartens or cultural centres were barely a 15-minute walk from the flats. Everything is uniform. It is the polar opposite of a human city. In this way, huge prefabricated housing estates were built in the 1950s on the outskirts of big cities. In the Soviet Union, they were called micro-rayons. The post-Stalinist construction method focused on function instead of design. Millions of Soviet citizens ended up living here. A new generation had grown up that no longer wanted battles. The hectic pace of the reconstruction years was over. A full refrigerator was more important to Soviet citizens than the eternal thought of the victory of socialism. The heroic man disappeared. Nikita Khrushchev knew this and ingratiated himself with his people precisely because he was different from Stalin. Khrushchev was a man of the people, a peasant's son with good instincts, and unlike his predecessor, he largely left his citizens alone politically. With him, a brief period of political thaw began in the 1950s. But what drove Khrushchev was his belief in the inevitable victory of socialism.
How many years has America existed already? 300? 150 years of independence. Well then, we will say America has existed 150 years, and this is her level of achievement. We have existed not quite 42 years, and 7 years from now, we will be on the same level of achievement as America.
His sense of superiority over the West's political system gave the Cold War some of its frostiest moments. Khrushchev liked to emphasize that the USSR produced missiles like sausages on an assembly line. He liked to show his strength, like his predecessors, at the famous parades. The parades were a barometer. Outside of the USSR, spectators tried to read calm or threat from the choreography of the parade. The perfectly functioning collective body symbolized the continuity of a world power that was to remain invulnerable forever and ever. On the 26th of April 1986, the behemoth Soviet Union went off the rails at 1:23 in the morning. After years of constant higher, faster, further, a meltdown occurred in Reactor 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, 120 kilometers from the Ukrainian capital, Kiev. Pressure tubes burst, cooling water leaked out, and the surrounding graphite blocks began to burn. The dreaded worst-case scenario had occurred. It took 10 days to extinguish the fire. Soldiers tried to remove the highly radioactive material without sufficient protective clothing, with only a shovel in their hands. It was a helpless, desperate attempt. Residents of the nearby town of Pripyat were not evacuated until 36 hours after the reactor accident. Too late to protect people from radiation poisoning. Today, no one lives there anymore. Chernobyl ended what began with the great communist promise of eternal progress. Everything was subordinated to that great goal. Until that day in April, when an engineer made a bad decision while simulating a blackout. Later, he would say that the design and poor condition of the reactor made the accident possible.
Не могу отнести.
Non, ce n'est pas un accident. C'est une catastrophe.
All over the world, people had been relying on nuclear power since the 1950s. Even then, it was known that fossil energy resources would one day dry up. In the Eastern Bloc, however, nuclear energy was expanded without discussing the risks. The disposal of nuclear waste was not a public issue. Nobody was interested in stopping overexploitation of forests either. The USSR cleared huge areas for decades. An East German documentary showed as early as the 1980s the consequences.
Noch bis vor kurzem ließen wir uns in unserem Leben von dem Gedanken leiten, wir können auf die Gaben der Natur nicht warten. Unsere Aufgabe ist es, sie von der Natur zu holen. Nun, davon ausgehend haben wir auch gehandelt. Wir haben viel genommen. Vielleicht zu viel, vielleicht zu eifrig.
This widespread irresponsibility took its toll. In a system where everything belongs to everyone, at a certain point, no one takes responsibility anymore. The eternally continuing narrative of the never-ending progress of socialism ended on the 26th of April 1986 in Chernobyl. My parents left the USSR after 3 years. They couldn't imagine living there. But, as they say, they got the best possible education. To this day, my parents speak fluent Russian. They still feel deeply connected to what is called the Russian soul. That, my mother says, is the warm core that will never be forgotten. The external harshness of the system, however, had already destroyed their faith in the Soviet Union. And ultimately, in socialism too. On the 7th of October 1989, the 40th anniversary of the GDR was celebrated in East Berlin. It was the country's last attempt to delude itself that everything could go on forever. The atmosphere was icy between East German head of state Erich Honecker and Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev. On his arrival in East Berlin, Gorbachev was greeted like a pop star. With his policy of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, transformation, he had begun to question the entire system of socialism. In East Berlin on this day, he uttered probably his most famous sentence.
Meinen Sie, dass die Situation jetzt in der DDR gefährlich ist?
Я думаю, опасности только подстерегают тех, кто не реагирует на жизнь.
Ich glaube, Gefahren warten nur auf jene, die nicht auf das Leben reagieren.
Just 4 weeks later, the Berlin Wall fell. It started the collapse of the entire Eastern Bloc. The end of the great idea of communism, the idea of better people and a fairer world. Yet, from the archives of this period, there are not only voices of euphoria, but also of deep thoughtfulness.
Ja, gibt es eine große Enttäuschung, dass das nun zu Ende ist mit der DDR, mit diesem sozialistischen Versuch? Wie denkst du?
Ja, es ist einerseits schade, dass dieser Versuch gescheitert ist, aber wir haben es ja nur am eigenen Leibe erfahren, dass das eben vorne und hinten nicht klappte und die Menschen einfach noch nicht so weit sind. Das wird nach wie vor ein Traum der Menschen bleiben, ja. Aber es ist eben zurzeit noch nicht möglich.
Ja. Noch inne. Was ist die Haltung?
Ist doch fantastisch.
Besser wie vorher.
Mikhail Gorbachev had brought freedom to Europe. In his own country, however, he would go down in history as the man who destroyed the Soviet Union. In 1990, he was booed by his people at the May Day celebrations in Moscow. The following year, on the 25th of December 1991, he announced his resignation. Afterwards, as usual, he wanted a cup of tea. However, his cup remained empty. The following day, the USSR was dissolved. All that remains of this great dream are the remnants of a vanished world.